Welcome to the Hope Academy of Senior Professionals August monthly meeting. We still haven't figured out what happened with the music a few seconds ago, but before I start, I just thought I'd give you an update. Today it's women 13, men 5. Okay. First, I want to remind you that today is primary election day. And besides voting for candidates, voters will decide the fate of several ballot proposals. I encourage you to vote if you have not already done so. The second thing I want to mention is that the fall curriculum is about ready for publication. The catalog is expected to be mailed next Monday the 13th. Online registration is scheduled for August 20th. We have 46 courses consisting of 106 sessions. Then the first class will begin September 10th. And Kim stopped me on the way in and wanted me to remind you, keep an eye on your emails over the next week. She's got some important things she wants to relate to you. Thirdly, the development that is happening on West 8th Street, as many of you know, continues to move towards completion. Last week, I talked to GDK Properties and got an update. The building being constructed just west of the Holland Sentinel will have 2 retail shops on the first floor and 21 apartments on the second and third floor. The next building west is Courthouse Square. It will be torn down and replaced by a structure that will consist of 30 apartments. The large 3-story steel frame building that you pass if you're coming north, coming south on Pine, being erected across from the 58th District Court, will have 3 tenants. The main tenant, Sperry's Movie House, will have 11 theaters with a seating capacity of approximately 500. Food can be ordered and delivered to your seat. Holland will be the second location for Sperry's, which is also located in Port Huron. Hopcat, that's H-O-P-C-A-T, one word, is a restaurant beer bar out of Grand Rapids that specializes in craft beer. This chain is now regional with 18 locations. Caka Bakery, that's one word, C-A-K-A Bakery, will offer custom-made desserts or have what they call grab-and-go desserts. This entire project between River and Pine, as many of you know, is expected to be done sometime next spring. Next, Carla Verschure, our membership chairperson, will introduce new HASP members and guests.
Thanks, Larry. I guess as he shares the growth in Holland, it's no surprise that we are filled to capacity this morning. In fact, we have 33 guests with us. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read their names, but I'm going to ask, if you are a guest today, would you please stand so we can recognize you? And if you are seated near someone who's a guest or you're walking out with them, be sure to introduce yourselves and give them a personal welcome to HASP. We also have 14 new members joining us today. And as I call your name, I'm going to ask you to come up and line up here so we can recognize you. Louis Earhart. Carolyn Ellison, who's reinstated. Russ Foy. Sandra Fraunheim, Susan Gardner, Jerry Lynn Gibbs, Ronald Gibbs, Cheryl Hulst, Celeste Tetters, Karen Van Doon, Don Vandenbrink, Joy Vandenbrink, Susan Warner, and William Warner. Please give them a HASP welcome. You may be seated. Those are the numbers Larry was referring to earlier. Last month when he gave numbers on membership, men and women, the women are still outnumbering the men.
Thank you, Carla. Dave Vanderwill, our program chair, will now introduce this morning's speaker.
Good morning. Before we introduce the speaker, let me just piggyback on Larry's comments earlier. As you continue along 8th Street, you notice that the Civic Center is nearing completion. We are going to make the Civic Center the topic of our October meeting, and so I invite you to join us again for that one to get an update on what our new Civic Center is all about. And then coupling on today's election day, you are well aware, I think, of some of the redistricting ballot proposal. Last week, the Supreme Court in Michigan decided that would appear on the November ballot. And in September, we will have Katie Fahey here as our monthly speaker. Katie was the person who initiated that redistricting ballot proposal. So she's going to tell us a bit about how that all came to be and why it's important that it get on the ballot. So that'll be our September program. But today is August, and today I think we have a particularly significant program, and I'm glad that you're here for it. I first of all want to thank the Curriculum Committee for their summer emphasis on Russia. Throughout the summer, we've taken a number of classes that have focused on Russian history and geography, on its literature and culture, its drama, its Orthodox Church, iconography. We've had classes that have introduced us to wide segments of Russian culture and society. This morning we're moving a bit into the political side and some of the history, and have as our speaker this morning Dr. Jim Butterfield, who's a political scientist from Western Michigan University. Jim is proficient in Russian, has made over 40 trips there, has spent several years as an associate faculty member teaching in Russian universities and throughout former Russian provinces or now independent countries. He's a person who has studied civil society, its disruption, and how it gets organized. And this morning he's going to take us into a look at this Russia that we wonder about. I think it's a very compelling topic because most of us have lived through a number of the changes that have happened in Russian society. We know about the czars. We've been taught about the communist revolution. We've seen that movement through the Stalin purges, the whole movement then from that into glasnost and perestroika. And then now we have the Putin era, and it's a country, I think, that holds some fascination for us. They've been allies, number one enemies, and sometimes a puzzle to us all. So this morning, we have Jim Butterfield with us. Jim, we're grateful you've given us your morning to come and join us, and we welcome you to HASP.
Can you hear me? Whoa. How about now? Are we getting feedback? What do I do?
Go a little higher with the mic, Jim.
Higher with the mic. Okay, how are we doing now?
Is the other mic off?
No, sorry.
Where is that?
Right behind, right behind.
Turn it off.
On the stand, yeah.
sure about that?
Yeah, yeah. Like behind here.
Oh, there. Sorry. No.
Sorry.
Okay, how are we doing now? Fabulous. Okay, thank you so much. I have to tell you, in my entire professional career, this is the first time my introduction has been preceded with a nice, hip, sort of in-musical interlude. I like it. I also, gosh, I got to say this. When Dave called me and we talked about coming here, and he told me how many people would be in attendance, I thought, okay, everybody, is eligible for some hyperbole. Turns out he was understating the case. This is just a mass of people here, and I really admire you for coming out on a beautiful August morning, and I'm grateful that the blinds are closed, because I know from 30 years of teaching that the students would much rather be looking outside and gazing at the trees than at me, so I think it was very wise to keep those closed. So thank you for coming. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to talking about this today. This originally came about as are we still? Okay. This originally came about as a presentation in recognition of the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, which was less than a year ago, in October, November, depending on which calendar that you use. And it's been a tumultuous 100 years, to say the least. And it's a period of tumult that I will argue continues. And a lot of it has to do with Russia, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union for 7 decades, and now post-Soviet Russia has been struggling to figure out what its future is, what it stands for, and what reason it exists. And I think that's one of the reasons we see that's part of the root of the problem with the United States and Russian relations right now. We've got a very firm 200-plus year political mythology, which we can dispute how accurate it is, but it serves us very well. We think we have a common identity despite all of our political tribalism and ethnic and racial differences. The Russians don't have that, and it's a bit of a handicap. I want to talk about identity first. As political scientists, we always like to define our terms. And I'm not going to give you a lot of political science jargon today. It'll put you to sleep way too fast. But I do want to talk about identity just a bit before we get talking about Russia, because we don't think about identity very seriously, typically speaking. We can, one of the most puzzling things is if you sit down over coffee and ask somebody, what is your identity? And they'll start to come up with a very quick answer, but then they start thinking about it, and it becomes kind of a complicated thing to talk about ourselves and what our identity is. And that has a lot to do with these points here. It's a fluid thing that changes over time. That's true for our personal identity. That's true for our national identity. And it's also multiple, and it's conflicting. Think about yourselves, your husbands, your wives, your fathers, your mothers, your children. You have maybe a religious affiliation, maybe you don't. You have a political orientation, maybe you don't. You could articulate a whole different set of identifying characteristics that pertain to you that come out at different times and are not necessarily consistent with one another. And that's true with national identity as well, very much so. So we can be very patriotic in a time of conflict and yet just be bitterly opposed when it becomes election time on some very key fundamental issues that are a core part of what we stand for. And that's just normal. That's just very, very normal. Identity is not something that can be easily built from above, which is one of the problems the Russians face right now. It's usually something that just kind of generates organically over a long period of time. And as we will see in the case of Russia, that organic kind of process of identity formation has had multiple threads which are in conflict with each other. This created some dilemma. So I said I'm going to go back 100 years. That's a bit of a lie. I'm going to go back a little bit farther than that to begin with, because I want to talk about what predated the Russian Revolution, which was the great Russian Empire, one of the last surviving land empires in the world. They all disappeared in World War I. And even the Russian Empire at points had a difficult time figuring out what it stood for. There were a lot of debates about these kind of things. And we go back to Peter the Great, one of the first great Russian czars. He really threw a wrench in the monkey wrench in the works by taking a hard look at Russian society at that time, deciding appropriately so that at least technologically speaking it was far, far behind the Western powers. And he engaged in some very disruptive policies to try to bring Russia into a more modern era not politically, obviously, but excuse me, in other terms of economic development and use of technology and things like that, for which he was praised by many and reviled by many others, especially the Orthodox Church at the time. But the real debate about Russian identity comes in the second half of the 19th century, starting in the middle of the century, and these intellectuals you see here are some of the key figures in this debate. Now, the common man and woman on the street was actually not on the street, they were in the fields, they were illiterate, they didn't debate these kind of things. This was strictly at the level of intellectuals, but these debates were really quite intense, and they foreshadow some of the issues we continue to deal with today. So the big debate at this time was between a group called themselves the Slavophiles and another group that called themselves the Zapadniki, or the Westernizers, who fell into these two very differentiated and mutually contradictory camps. The Slavophiles believed firmly that there was something very special and unique about Russian culture that ought to be preserved. It was rooted in its rural nature, it's kind of close to the land, lifestyle. It was very much rooted in orthodoxy, Russian orthodoxy in particular, which you must remember, well, there was good reason for the Russians to believe, as they did for a long time, that Moscow was actually the center of Christianity after the fall of Constantinople in the middle of the 15th century. The Roman Church was very, very corrupt and politically kind of divided, and the Eastern Orthodox Church in Constantinople fell and fled to various places, and so the center of Christianity in the minds of many was actually Moscow. They preserved Eastern Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy, which they argue is really the direct kind of lineage going back to the time of Christ, and so on. And so Russian culture in the mind of Slavophiles was that kind of pure, traditional society, and that these values needed to be preserved. And all this Western stuff about individualism and materialism and economic development and the Enlightenment and liberal values and so on was just a corruption of the real traditional pure values that Russian culture preserved. They were lost in most of the rest of the world. Now the Westernizers looked at this and they said, no, that's actually not the case at all. These people are excusing backwardness. They're excusing the persistence of poverty. Excuse me. And the rest of the world is just going to leave us behind. In fact, already are leaving us behind in terms of economic development, longer lifespans, better health indicators, higher levels of education, and all the things that we associate with the Industrial Revolution and the thriving period of capitalism that came in the 19th century and throughout Europe in particular. So you can see these are diametrically opposed positions, and they were hotly debated in the salons and in philosophical treatises and so on of the time. Of course, politically, it was an autocracy in the hands of the Tsar, very conservative by all dimensions. But there was an economic development and industrialization process taking place at this time, so society was changing, albeit somewhat gradually. And these kind of debates fed into discussions about policies, about military alliances and things like that, how Russia would position itself. Now, on top of this, Russian Empire was an empire. It was not just a country, it was an empire. It was a multinational, multi-ethnic empire in which there were well in excess of 100 different languages spoken. And its own identity at the time as an empire was something that was under discussion, under dispute at some point. As an empire, generally we think of empires as being these sort of expansive, in this case, land empires, which incorporate lots of different peoples, and they're supposedly all sort of working together under one leader, and the ethnic differences are not supposed to make a big difference, and we'll see that actually replicated in the Soviet period, that same kind of sentiment. In fact, by the late 19th century, there were groups of people that were saying, but wait a minute, what we really are is Russian. We may call ourselves an empire, and we may have Uzbeks, in Islam, Muslims, and we may have Jews, and we may have Latvians and Lithuanians, and we may have Georgians, and we may have various other, Arctic peoples and so on. But what we really are is Russian. And that's what we should accentuate, because after all, that's what makes us unique. It's kind of Slavophilism, which has now become very politicized, by saying it doesn't matter who else lives here, they live here at the courtesy of us, the Russians, and our books should be in Russian, and our educational system should be in Russian, and all of our political documents should be in Russian. And so there was this emphasis to Russify, and again express this Slavophile identity in the form of these three principles: orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. And the Tsar himself was conceived of as being not only the political leader of the country, but also the head of the Orthodox Church. So there was this kind of unification of nationalism, of political identity, of religious identity in the figures of a single person. Well, guess what happened to that? Along comes 1917, and this autocracy was very weak, politically very weak, for a variety of reasons. Nicholas himself was not a particularly dynamic leader, and the country was just going to hell in a handbasket anyway because of its economic backwardness, because of its foreign entanglements, and of course World War I accelerated the process. And into the process, into this stepped these three individuals, actually stepped the guy on the left, Vladimir Lenin. The man on the right is Karl Marx, and the one in the middle is Friedrich Engels. Those are the two architects of the ideas of communism. Lenin came along and came up with a recipe for introducing it through a revolutionary process in practice, and everything changed by the end of 1917. This was a very conscious rejection of tradition. I mean, everything Marx wrote about was that tradition does nothing but sustain inequality and exploitation. Religion helps sustain exploitation and inequality. Right? Traditional class identities, private property, all these things just serve to preserve the status quo, which is unjust, was the argument. They believed that this was a scientific process, not rooted in some kind of emotional position, not rooted in some kind of spiritual identity or something like this. These were sort of the rational understandings of how society worked to the disadvantage of the lower classes, to the benefits of the propertied classes. And so they wanted to modernize, as they saw, which was get rid of class identity and get rid of all forms of exploitation and get rid of religion because it just convinced people to accept the status quo, which was by definition unjust. And they wanted to industrialize. The first thing that Lenin did, once they won the Civil War, was to launch a massive electrification program for Russia because they were economically backward. They didn't even have a good energy grid or a good transportation grid. So part of the modernization process was investing in these very infrastructure improvements and eventually building universities on a massive scale in public education and moving towards 100% literacy and so on and so forth. All this being understood as modernization and according to some kind of scientific process that would result in the improvement of man and woman as we know them. So let's move into the Soviet period now. And I want to ask the question, was there a coherent Soviet identity? There certainly was an attempt to create a Soviet identity. And I'll take you back to one of my introductory comments, which is that identity is very difficult to create from above. It's something that generally develops somewhat organically. But on the other hand, the policies of a very powerful state, one would assume must have some impact over time, like educating everybody, and not only just educating them in terms of their ability to read and do math, but also according to the tenets of Marxism, Leninism, and kind of the collective endeavor and so on and so forth. So what was the result of that? How effective was the Soviet state in creating from above a Soviet identity? Well, first of all, let's look at what they promoted. Clearly it was anti-Western, anti-capitalist. We were the enemy. We were the enemy because we protected these values of liberalism and religious freedom and private property and class differentiation and so on. We were also the enemy because we were very much opposed to their existence for a very long period of time. The political ideology was paramount. There used to be an old saying in Russia that the future never changes. The past periodically does, as we reinterpret. Who's standing on the podium next to Stalin? Oops, there he is. Oops, no, he's gone. But the future never changes. The future is always communism. The ideal society of no class identity, no exploitation, and so on. So the fealty was not to a god, not to an ethnic identity, a linguistic identity. It was to the creed, to the communist ideal and the process of building communism. However, the Soviets were smart enough to realize you don't just get rid of ethnic identity. People grow up in linguistic traditions. The language we speak in the home growing up affects how we see the world. The way we formulate concepts and ideas in our native language inevitably affects how we look at the world. Of course, we all have in our various, it's not so much in the case of a country like the US where we have this assimilation process which is very powerful, but in many countries which are multi-ethnic in nature, you can go from one community to another and you see different folk songs and different artistic traditions and so on. And the Soviets recognized that this was inevitable and they said this is okay. And you see this photograph right here, this is on Red Square, and you see all these people dressed in their native dress. Of course, nobody ever actually dressed like this since the 19th century, 17th century. But on holidays and festivals and so on, they would show up, and that was okay. It was okay for people to have pride in their ethnicity. It was okay for people to speak their native languages as long as they did not politicize it. As long as they never took the step of saying, okay, I'm proud of my Latvian heritage, or I'm proud of my Kazakh heritage, I think we should be independent. I think we should have an independent Latvia or an independent Kazakhstan. That was absolutely forbidden. So you could not politicize it. You could celebrate your ethnicity, and as long as you did not politicize it. And the slogan that the Soviets adopted was a national in form, but socialist in content. Nationalist in form meaning, yeah, you can wear your clothes if you want, you can sing your songs, you can speak your language, but in terms of who we are politically, what our political identity is, we are all socialist. As we will see, that didn't work. They were even against Russian national identity. And you see this very early on. This is in 1923, one of the early congresses of the Communist Party after the Civil War was over, at the point where they're really just kind of starting to get down to the business of building this communist society. And one of the first things that they collectively rejected was Russification. Because according to communism, national identity ultimately really doesn't matter in terms of the future that we build. Yes, we can all speak different languages and so on, but the key is that we're working together collectively to build a better society. And this was just as true for the Russians, who dominated the Congress, as it was for these ethnic minorities. That this was fine to feel pride in your ethnic group, but it is not a core identity for people. And so it resulted in things like this. This is Yuri Gagarin. He was the first person in space, and not surprisingly, a big hero in the Soviet Union. I never learned about this guy in my K through 12 education. Well, I guess I finally did by high school, but I always learned John Glenn was the first man in space. He was the third man in space, but the first American. This was the guy that was the first one that sort of really shocked us at the time. First there was Sputnik. Some of you probably remember that soccer-sized satellite that went up in the late 1950s that just scared the hell out of us. Not that it could do anything, but the point was they got it up before we got one up. And then they got the first man in space, and so not surprisingly, he was a big hero in the Soviet Union. And there's this little piece of poetic drivel which was taught to school kids that illustrates this issue about an identity that supersedes ethnicity. And I'm going to read it to you in Russian because it rhymes in a nice little way in Russian, but you can read it what it says here in English. Хорошо, что наш Гагарин не еврей, не татарин, не грузин, не узбек, а наш советский человек. He's our Soviet man. He was in fact Russian, but the point, that was not supposed to matter. He belonged to everybody. In World War II, this was accentuated to some degree, but it was also somewhat of a reversion during World War II because the threat was enormous. You must know the number of people that died in World War II was in the tens of millions. The country was, the major portion of European Russia was occupied by the Germans, and if it wasn't destroyed on the way in, it was destroyed as they retreated. They were fighting for their lives. We were sort of fighting for the stability of the world and our future and so on, but we weren't fighting on American soil other than Pearl Harbor. They were fighting right in their homes, right in their cities and so on. And so they appealed to a much more traditional type of patriotism for a brief period. They said, you know, this whole concept of a motherland is very non-communist, very non-scientific. It's about an emotional tie to the land. It sometimes even spilled over into kind of a Russian nationalism because it was really predominantly the Slavic portions of the country that suffered. And so there was a very strong civic patriotism. Still, the idea that we are beholden to, we are loyal to something bigger than ourselves as individuals was accentuated during this time period. And then came the great rebuilding and a very prosperous period in the Soviet Union for a couple of decades, in which officially our identities were accentuated as being class-based. All right, the identity was, supposedly classes were disappearing, but you know, communism had not been fully attained yet, so there were still classes, but there was no exploitation among them. You were identified even in your passports by class. You were either a member of the working class, or you were a peasant, which meant you worked on a collective farm, or you had an occupation which involved the mine, so you were teachers or bureaucrats or engineers or something of that type. Officially, that was the identity of the country on an individual level. You were one of these three groups. One of these three groups, and it's underscored in the Constitution at the time. So again, no indication of a strong ethnic identity or any kind of countervailing political identity. And I would argue that maybe this was, by the time the Soviet Union started deteriorating in the 1980s, maybe this was at the heart of the identity, the Soviet social contract. This is what they did well. No homelessness, no unemployment, 100% access to health care. Not always the greatest health care, but everybody had access to it. Nobody was starving. Nobody was malnourished. Shortages in the stores. The quality of meat was not particularly good, but again, nobody was going without. And incredible progress in education. 100% literacy, even in the most backward areas of the Soviet Union. More higher education degrees per capita than anyone else in the world. And that kind of pride, that kind of progress, following, first of all, the poverty of the Russian Empire, and then subsequently the devastation of World War II, gave them an immense source of pride. And when you would ask people, in the 1980s, when I first started going to the Soviet Union, I would have conversations with people in bars and whatnot, and we get into these debates. And they would say, yeah, you have these great grocery stores, all the food you want and so on, but not everybody can buy all that stuff. You know, and they would talk about exploitation of Native Americans and of blacks and so on and so forth. And they would say, we don't have any of that stuff. We may not live as well as you do according to, you know, material measures and so on, but we're all secure. Now we can, you know, sort of debate these values. I'm simplifying things tremendously, but this is how people very often saw their life. This is a point I would argue that they were no longer, if they ever did, buying into the communist mythology of a future without classes, without exploitation, without greed. I think that idealism largely disappeared by World War II in the eyes of most people. But this was not a bad substitute. All right, this was, in the minds of many, the good society, where nobody suffered. Nobody suffered. And the argument was this absence of suffering, this absence of poverty, this absence of greed, this absence of materialism would lead to what they called at the time the new Soviet man. And the new Soviet man was this highly idealized person who represented these values of hard work and collectivism and collective gain over individual personal gain. And look at some of the imagery associated with this. Look at these guys. And they're beautiful, aren't they? Strong, optimistic, young. There's a young woman collecting the harvest in the fields. Now, I don't know how many of you were ever farmers, but even if you worked on a garden on a hot July day, you don't look like this. But big smile, and I mean, have you ever seen a farmer with a purely white shirt? Okay, no smudges, no so on. Of course, this is idealized, and this is one of my favorites. This is from the 1970s. No trans fats for me. And one of my favorite pieces of statuary, I still love seeing this when I'm in Moscow and I get to that part of Moscow. This is on the north side of Moscow, and this, you can't tell from this photograph, but this is big. This is a very big bronze statue, and on the left you see a worker holding up the hammer, and on the right you see the peasant, female peasant worker holding up the sickle. And my God, look at them. Muscular, tall, confident, striding towards the future. Again, these two classes that continue to survive side by side, the peasants and the workers, but not in conflict with one another, in fact, working together to build this wonderful future of communism. Just look at the optimism in these images. These were the new Soviet men and women. Young, confident, hardworking, working together to build the future. Well, that was the official perspective. Over time, that began to deteriorate. There was a lot of post-war optimism because of the rebuilding that took place, because of the hunger disappearing, the massive housing construction where people moved out of communal apartments where they shared, 10 people would live in I'm going to put it this way, there'd be 10 apartments, single-room apartments sharing a kitchen and a bath. Some of those still survived when I started going in the 1980s. You would not want to live in those conditions, believe me. They gave way to individual apartments. Again, not opulent, but where families could have their own places to live. More food appeared in the stores. Educational opportunities were extended to everybody. Hospitals were built everywhere. It was a time of thriving growth and productivity. But it was also an economic system that could only last so long. And I'm not going to get into a lot of details here about this because it's a debated question, and it's a very complicated one. But my argument is that the Soviet Union, irrespective of anything we did, collapsed on its own. We can argue and have argued among ourselves to what degree we hastened that process, but the fact is that it was an economic system that was designed to build lots and lots of things fast. Lots of miles of railroad tracks, lots of factories, lots of hospitals, lots of airports, lots of port facilities, lots of ships, lots of airplanes, lots of fighter jets, but not efficiently. Fast, but not efficiently. And as the world moved into the information age in the post-war period, the Soviets just simply could not keep up. I'm a graduate student, right? In the 1980s, I'm in the Soviet Union. I can't even get access to a photocopier, which was a pain in the butt because I had to copy all this stuff by hand. Why? Because, first of all, there weren't very many of them, and second of all, they didn't trust people to have photocopiers because you might photocopy something you're not supposed to be reading. Computers were really, really fundamental at the time. When I was in graduate school, we were just getting Apple desktops. Had been the new revolutionary thing. They were way behind that in the Soviet case. And just in terms of efficiency, there was no way they could move into a really modernized economy because of the bureaucratic torpor and the heavy hand of particularly the Communist Party, which stifled innovation. And economies need to constantly innovate. And the Soviet economy at some point became unable to do that, and it started deteriorating. Economic growth rates by the late 1970s were probably negative, although we don't have good data. They were longer lines in the stores, and people would wait 10 years on a waiting list to get an automobile if they could afford one, and so on. So cynicism became the norm. Instead of this optimism, which we saw a lot of in the 1950s, by the late 1970s and 1980s, a lot of cynicism and distrust in the future. And somebody an intellectual coined this term, Homo sovieticus. He said, okay, the administration, the government wants us to believe we've got a new Soviet man. Instead, what we really have is a Homo sovieticus, which just doesn't care. He's pessimistic, he doesn't work hard, he tries to get away with as much as he can at work. She's not optimistic about the future. She doesn't care about politics. She doesn't buy into the rhetoric of the state. And just nobody sees, this Homo Sovieticus just doesn't really see a future in communism or the communist state. Used to see people going to see movies, and occasionally they would have movies from Europe in Soviet theaters. And there was one time I saw this, I don't even remember what the movie was, but there was an argument taking place between a man and a woman in a grocery store. And I noticed the people I was sitting with were studying the shelves. They were studying, it was in the fruit and vegetable section, they were looking at this and thinking, my God, you know, they forgot the plot. It was all these fresh fruits and vegetables that were in the backdrop. This kind of thing. I mean, they were not living in complete informational vacuum. They were aware of the fact that material conditions in the West were far superior to those in the Soviet Union. And so they wanted something else. And as they began to look around for alternative forms of identity, many times they fell back on ethnicity, particularly the non-Russians. This in particular is a rally in Latvia, which is where one of the strongest forms of alternative ethnic identity was expressed in the 1980s, resulted in, they were one of the early countries to declare independence from the Soviet Union. And it was really this resurgence of ethnic identity as a way of looking for an alternative to the failures of communism that brought the system down. The sort of straw that broke the camel's back was the expressions of ethnic identity all over the Soviet Union, but especially in the European portions and the Caucasian portions of the country. They just basically said, we want to be on our own. Now, this is the seductive message of ethnic separatism, is we're better off on our own. Even though often the case it's not true, there is this perception when you're in a crisis situation that, gee, if we just left, our ethnic group just left and we were self-governed, we'd be better off. So the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of 1991. We're all old enough to remember this. And that gave way to one hell of a decade, the 1990s. This was a rough period. In late 1991, early 1992, very early 1992, I would talk with people in Russia, and they would talk to me about how optimistic they were, how excited they were to finally have democracy and move into a market economy, and they would thrive just like the West. They would have no shortages, they would have opportunities to travel, they would grow wealthy, or if not wealthy, at least comfortable. There was this just tremendous euphoric excitement about what capitalism and democracy that would bring. That lasted about 6 months. Because to reform a communist economy and make it into a market economy, one of the things you have to do is get the state out of certain aspects of the economy, like setting prices. And in fact, the Russians opted to do this in very quick fashion, following the argument, the position of Jeffrey Sachs of Harvard, who designed the policy that came to be known as shock therapy. They said you should go through the pain of the transition as rapidly as possible. And in fact, the pain of the transition for Russia in 1992 was 2,500% inflation. It is hard for me to convey to you what that did to the Russian psyche. So I was there in the summer of 1991, and there were a lot of shortages. You'd have to stand in line even to buy the quintessential ice cream cone that you can normally buy on the street, easily. In 1992, I'm there, and I thought, okay, this is going to be, I was there during the Christmas season, too, of 1991, 1992, just before the Soviet Union collapsed, when there was all this euphoria. And then in the summer of 1992, I show up, and I'm walking down the street, and there's 2 rows on each side of me of women trying to sell things out of their closets just to try to make a little money to cope with the rapid inflation. It was a hellish decade of political instability, of economic turmoil, of huge decline in living standards. It was managed much better in Eastern Europe, partly because they had the assistance of the European Union. So the East European communist countries, for the most part, didn't go through this degree of pain. It was the Russians that really probably suffered at the worst, not even the rest of the former Soviet space, because they went through a much slower and very often incomplete or non-existent reform process. But the Russians decided to launch in, head first, and it was very painful for them. And to some degree, they blame us. We had advisors in Moscow in the 1990s that were trying to coach them on how to make this transition, and they listened to our advice. And some of that advice was very selfishly motivated, and some of it was just poorly informed because we didn't know any more about completely transforming a communist economy than they did. Their blaming us, I think, is convenient. They made a lot of these decisions, and they were not particularly good decisions along the way, but this is how things play out. You look for somebody to blame when you go through this kind of turmoil, And they blame their own political leadership, Boris Yeltsin and others to some degree, but they certainly blame us as well for kind of pushing them in this direction and actually not making them strong, but weakening them. This is a long-standing Russian belief, is that if you're not careful, the rest of the world will take advantage of you. And there are now 3 times in Russian history that in the Russian psyche that happened. One was in the time of troubles before the appointment of the Romanovs. This is back at the beginning of, if I get this straight, 17th century. There was like a 13, 14-year period where there was no clear czar, and they were getting invaded and all kinds of turmoil took place. The second time was in the 1917, between the revolutions, and then shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution, when there were invasions from the Czechs, the Brits, and even a few Americans participated in this. And the third time, supposedly, was after the collapse of communism in the 1990s, when they were weak. And we were in there trying to buy up their property and exploit their markets and things like this. This is sort of the perception, that we wanted to keep their military weak, we wanted to keep their markets open for us, and so our policy advice to them was designed to do just exactly that. Just exactly that. Now, along comes Putin in 2000, which coincided with 2 other things taking place. One was that the economy was finally starting to feel the benefits of the reform process. And number 2, oil prices were extremely low at the time he came to power, which meant that they were making, but they started going up rapidly. So there were this kind of windfall profits that took place in the early 2000s. And he really kind of clamped down on these policies that were resulting in kind of the disintegration of the country, the separatism that was taking place, and so on. There's a long history here I won't get into. But he centralized authority in a way that Russians largely appreciated, because they saw the decentralization that took place in the 1990s was leading to more economic decline and more divisiveness. In fact, public opinion polls in the 1990s asked the question, what do you fear the most? And frequently the top response was civil war. We're afraid we're descending into such weakness that we're just going to go to war with each other. That's what people feared more than anything. And of course, Putin comes along and he reimposes authority, he centralizes decision making, and it was appreciated. Even if not everybody likes his tactics, it was quite appreciated. And that's one of the reasons he remains powerful to this day. This perception that if it wasn't for being strong, the rest of the world, particularly the United States, would take advantage of them and seek to undermine them as much as we could. But Putin doesn't stand for just a strong state. I'm going to argue to you that he and those people who support him have a semi-coherent view of what they want Russia to be, but not a particularly coherent long-term view. Now, let me explain. I like this little graphic that you see here. You notice on the left on the bottom you see the Orthodox Church. In the middle you see the Kremlin. And on the right you see these skyscrapers, which are now part of the Moscow skyline, something that's appeared in the last 2 decades. And what Putin's rhetoric and his policies seem to express is that these 3 are all equal parts of the emerging Russian identity. So the tradition that goes with orthodoxy, or that at least gets expressed in most coherent terms in the form of orthodoxy, the strong state to protect the interests of Russia and make it a great power once again, and protect it from predatory powers like us and like the EU. And finally, modernity. Skyscrapers, big highways, they have a tremendous public transportation system in Moscow, and it just keeps growing. It was frozen for, gosh, I don't know, a decade and a half, and now it's just tremendous growth of new subway stations and new ring roads and light rail and so on and so forth. They've got an emphasis, they're trying very hard to build a Silicon Valley, not going particularly well, but the emphasis is still on this kind of technology and capitalism. Don't believe for a second that Russia is not capitalist. It very much is, and modernity. What I don't see coming from Putin or anyone else in Russia is an idea of where Russia would like to see itself 50 years from now, other than being a great power. All right, all of us that are big countries have great power pretensions. Right, we believe that our way of life is the best. We want to protect our interests. We want to project our interests as much as we possibly can. And Russia, having historically been a great power, wants to return to that status. But I don't see a really coherent idea of what beyond that they want to be. You know, do they want to eventually be a thriving democracy? How are they going to negotiate this tension between the remnants of collective identity, which you still find also in orthodoxy, and the liberalism that goes with capitalism, which is very much rooted now in Russian society? I don't see a lot of good thinking about that. And I think it's a hard row to hoe in any event. Let's talk about what this means in terms of how Russia sees itself in the world. Dave, when am I supposed to be done? 5 more minutes, okay. Okay, I want to leave time for that. Let's talk about what this means. This is an interesting, very interesting cartoon. So you see there in the middle, you see Uncle Sam. And you may not be able to tell, but he's carrying a briefcase with a NATO insignia on it. And he keeps opening these doors and going through them. And so on the far left, that's Serbia. And then comes Iraq, and then Libya, and then Syria. And this cartoon came out in 2014 at the time that the Ukrainian crisis was coming to a head. And the perception here is that, you know, here we are, we go around the world in our adventurism, and all we do, whatever we say we're doing about spreading democracy and promoting human rights and so on, all we're doing is leaving a path of destruction behind us. And so we come to a new door, and we open up the Ukrainian door, and who's standing there? A very powerful Russian bear. And he's just saying, just try to come through this door. Just try. Just try. They look at our record of the past several decades, and they say, they claim that there's an awful lot of hypocrisy, and they claim we don't have a lot to show for our foreign intervention except a lot of destruction. And so on. And to that degree, they've started to assert their position in the world. And one way they do that is to say, well, look, this is the former Soviet space. This is our sphere of influence. You, NATO, you, the United States, tried to encroach on that by incorporating the 3 Baltic states into NATO, and the EU. There's not going to be any more of that. You've claimed your spheres of influence for decades, even centuries. This is our sphere of influence. Stay the hell out of it. And that's a very, very strong message that we get now. Up until 2008, there was even talk during the W administration of incorporating Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. Nobody even talks about that anymore. It's completely unrealistic, and Russia would go to war to prevent it for these reasons. Here's another cartoon I like. I don't know how well you can see this in the back. It's, of course, full of all kinds of trite expressions. So you see the Russian with a big hat, fur hat, balalaika in the back seat sticking out. On the left side, on the left side there, you can see people clearly in the West. I don't know if you can tell there's a guy with his headphones on, you know, and his kind of satchel under his arm. On the right, all these, you know, the Vietnamese, the Chinese. Again, nobody dresses like this anymore, but that's it's not key to this. And you see the guys driving right down the middle between East and West. In fact, he's got 2 steering wheels. I don't know if you can tell this. He's driving with both hands. Right. So the whole thing is kind of absurd, but it illustrates that this is one of the things Russia wrestles with. So who are we? Are we European? Are we Asian? The fact is they're both. So we're Eurasian. That's what they say. We're Eurasian. Well, what in the world does Eurasian mean? It means it's something unique and unto itself. They're diving down the middle. And in a way, you can interpret this as, well, we don't know which way to go. But in a way, you can interpret this as saying, we're not East, we're not West. We're just going straight ahead. We're Russian. We got our own identity and our own path. I'm going to skip a couple things here. I'm going to just give you this quote from Putin just last year, a year and a half ago, less than that, a year ago, less. In which he said, he made this point about this being a Eurasian space. But culturally, he still said we're European. He acknowledged the fact that the country is still heavily influenced by European philosophy, European traditions. After all, capitalism emerged in Europe first and foremost. And so there's some confusion even still at this stage. We're Eurasian, our space is Eurasian, our resources are out there in Siberia and the Far East. We're orienting our markets very much now towards China and Japan and South Korea. But we're also still European. And I argue that incoherence, that uncertainty about what they are and what they stand for, is still at the very core of its difficulties with expressing a national identity today. And I'll leave you with this. This is the new tourist logo of Russia, unveiled about 6 months ago. What do you think you're looking at here? What'd you say? Thought I heard somebody say it. Does it remind you of any artists? Does anybody know Kazimir Malevich? The supremacist artist? He did a lot of these geometric shapes and so on. What you may find hard to believe is this is actually a map of Russia, according to the people that designed it. All right, so the big yellow portion is European Russia, and the big purple circle is Siberia, and the orange vertical line is the Ural Mountains, and the orange area there on the left is Ukraine, not Ukraine, it's obviously not Ukraine, it's not part of Russia, but it's the Caucasus. And the little square you see on the far left, guess what that is? That's Crimea. Yes, that's Crimea. And way out on the right, you've got the Far East, the Kamchatka, close to the Alaska, the Alaskan Straits, and so on. And they settled on this, and I kind of find it interesting because they chose not to go with the old cupolas, the beautiful Russian churches. That's the hackneyed sort of symbol of Russia, or these old. Remember seeing the Russian Olympic uniforms with all these traditional peasant frills and so on them that they were using? This is a statement that we're a modern country. Now, Malevich was a Russian artist, so they're drawing on his style, but they're also saying these are the pieces that fit together in this very kind of modernist way. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
We do have time for a few questions. If you'll wait for the mic and then stand up when you talk so Jim can see where you are. Marilyn has a mic in the back here, and I've got one over here.
Could you trace briefly Jewish ethnicity in Russian history?
I can try. It's certainly a big part of the Jewish diaspora ended up in the Slavic lands of the Russian Empire and extending into Eastern Europe. And they suffered. They suffered quite a bit because there's a lot of anti-Semitism. One of the interesting things I found in the 1990s when I was going several times a year as a junior faculty, you're kind of hungry to get out of the field, was a resurgence of anti-Semitism, including publications you could buy on the street of the so-called Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is this very anti-Semitic, inflammatory document which supposedly comes from, well, the argument is it comes from Jewish elders. Of course, it comes from anti-Semites in the Russian Empire that talk about this international Jewish conspiracy and so on and so forth. Anti-Semitism is still an issue, and in fact, the one sustained flow of immigration, outflows, that took place in the 1970s and 80s that was permitted by the Soviets were Jews, either coming to the United States or to Israel itself. I was just at a grocery store last week in Evanston, and wow. I mean, it was just really impressive walking up and down the aisles. I felt like I was in Moscow or Saratov or something because of that. Officially, even today and in the Soviet period, Jews are welcomed. Unofficially, there's still a fair amount of anti-Semitism. There are synagogues which continue to thrive. They don't suffer any more vandalism than our own synagogues do, which means they do suffer some, but not that much. There hasn't been anything like a pogrom in a long time. But there was such an outflow of Jews in that immigration period, the so-called third wave of immigration with an E during the 70s and the 1980s, that percentage-wise, they're a pretty small number of people. Officially, they were given their own homeland by Stalin, way the hell out in Siberia. Of course, in fact, the ones that stayed in the country are mostly confined to urban areas in the European portion of Russia. There's not a lot of command of Hebrew, for example. There's not a lot of attendance to synagogues and so on, but there's even now, there's not enough synagogues to go around, but there's still not enough churches to go around either. So they're still undergoing, for all religions, a pretty massive construction effort to try to keep up with the resurgence of religious observance which has taken place in the last 2 decades.
Got one here in the front row, and then we'll come back to Maryland.
Would you say that part of the reason why the Russian Revolution was so atheistic was because of how much the empire was tied so tightly with the Orthodox Church during the Russian Empire?
In a way, the answer is yes, but it goes much deeper than that, because the very core of Marxist philosophy is that religion really doesn't matter. It's a fiction which is created by the property-owning class to tell the peasant who is frustrated with her living standards that all she has to do is be a good Christian and she'll be rewarded in the afterlife. So certainly the belief was that orthodoxy helped sustain the very unjust system, as the communists saw it, of the Russian Empire, but that would be understood as being par for the course for anywhere else in the world at the same time.
Over here. So at the height of the Cold War, we were very fearful of the Soviet Union and its capabilities and threat. After its demise, there was general consensus that we really overestimated their abilities, and our fear was a bit unfounded. Where are we today in that regard? Are we once again overestimating its capability because of Putin and his capabilities to speak, or is there a real threat?
I think that we have a very clear idea what their capabilities are, but I think politically we exaggerate the danger, as do they. I will tell you this, reading the Russian, reading or listening to the Russian media and listening to or reading the American media, gosh, this just sounds like they're copying and pasting each other, just reversing the names around. So when they talk about us as an existential threat to the Russian way of life and the Russian state, we talk about them in exactly the same way. So there are real differences, obviously, in interest between our two countries. There's no question about that. And we are in this period where we are now escalating arms once again. We're modernizing our nuclear capabilities, and they turn around and say, well, we're modernizing ours as well. We're kind of fueling that just like we did in the Cold War, which is in some ways unfortunate because we got enough. I mean, if you look at the chart of nuclear weapons, you've got the United States here and Russia here, and then here's China down here, number 3 place, and then the UK and on down the line. And we have so many nuclear weapons, either ready to go at a moment's notice, or which could be what do they call it, taken out of kind of storage and made ready to go at any point. So now it's not so much more nuclear weapons, it's better delivery systems so they can creep under radar and things like that. Our weapons for so long were ICBMs, the missiles which would get launched from, say, Nebraska or Kazakhstan. You can see 30 minutes ahead of time that they're coming. Now we're trying to find ways to get them to sneak right, like cruise missiles do, just sneak right along the ground and under the radar, and they're doing the same thing. So yes, the threat is clearly there. We're just as big a part of it as I see it as they are. And when we, again, I want to say we've got some real differences and some real conflicts of interest, no question about it, to the point where we overlook where we have commonality of interest in things like fighting global terrorism and so on. We're very much on the same side of that. But we not only forget about that, we sort of just start ignoring it and not even devoting resources to it and so on. And so we engage in this kind of political one-upmanship that results in investment of resources in something that probably ultimately neither one of us need to do. So it's both real and at the same time exaggerated in this, I think, this vicious cycle, as I see it.
Our final question in the back.
As you were describing the cynicism and pessimism that were overtaking Russia in the 70s and 80s, I couldn't help but see a parallel between what was going on there at that time and what is happening here in our time with regard to our democratic institutions. Am I off on that? Could you comment on that? Do you see a parallel?
Oh, that's a loaded question, isn't it? So I'm going to start by saying no.
Thank you.
And that what they were dealing with were declining quality of housing, stores with empty shelves, lots of empty shelves and things like that. I mean, we're not in an economic crisis here. Although I just read last week that 80% of us live paycheck to paycheck. I didn't get to see the methodology of how that's been determined, but that means that amidst all this, wealth that we have, there are a lot of people that are still struggling. There does seem to be a crisis here, though, in the United States, a crisis of confidence in ourselves. And I will say this, my students are a whole lot less confident about the future of the United States than my generation was. Well, our generation was. They don't believe Social Security is going to be around for them when the time comes, because we're going to use it all up. They don't have a lot of confidence in the tribalism in Washington, and that's not pro-Democrat or pro-Republican. It's anti-both in many respects and so on. So I think we can exaggerate the crisis, but at the same time, I sort of get your point, particularly among America's youth. Right now they're tremendous, my students at least, they're tremendously entrepreneurial, very engaged, they do a lot of volunteer work. They're working very hard on their own futures and so on, but they don't seem to have a lot of confidence about our kind of collective future for whatever reason that may be. But I don't think that's the same level of despair that the Soviets were looking at in the 1970s and 1980s, where they felt like we don't know where the hell we're going and things just seem to be getting constantly worse in a very basic material way. We drive down these streets right here, they're lovely. So the streets, once you get outside of the major cities in the Soviet Union in the 1980s, were just pothole-ridden or mud or things like this. We're still at a much higher level of prosperity and economic development.
Jim, we want to say thanks for your presentation this morning.
Thank you.